Before photographs became the language of memory, before cameras fit into pockets, before entire lifetimes could be captured in seconds, there was a single moment when the world was photographed for the very first time. A moment when one man pointed a primitive device toward a quiet French courtyard and captured something that had never been captured before. Light itself, frozen in time. This story is not only about a photograph. It is about patience beyond imagination, failure stretched over decades, an obsession that consumed a lifetime, and the peaceful, almost sacred stillness of a world untouched by cameras. It is the story of a man who believed light could be held like ink on a page, a belief so strange in his era that most dismissed it as madness. And yet, one day in the early 1820s, in a small upstairs room overlooking the family estate, Joseph Nicephore Niepce opened a window and pointed a box-shaped device toward the sunlit courtyard. He had no idea how long he should expose the metal plate. He simply left it there for hours, maybe days, watching shadows crawl slowly across the walls, barns, and rooftops. What emerged was the world's oldest surviving photograph. Grainy, silent, ghostly, but undeniably real. A window frozen forever. In this calming, immersive script, we will walk through Niepce's life, his mind, his failures, his home, his quiet experiments, the birth of camera technology, and the profound legacy of the first captured image. Each section reveals a different layer of this remarkable story, with no repetition, only deepening curiosity. Let's begin. Section 1. The World Before Photography. To understand the importance of the world's first photograph, we must first step back into the era before images could be captured at all. A time when the only way to preserve a moment was through memory, words, or the hand of an artist. This was a world where light was mysterious, fleeting, untouchable. A world in which shadows could not be held, and time passed without leaving any imprint except in human minds. In the late 1700s and early 1800s, society relied heavily on painting and drawing to preserve faces, places, and events. Portrait artists spent hours studying the human face, memorizing lines and shadows. Landscape painters stood outdoors with easels, racing the sun before the light changed. Every image depended on the skill, or bias, of the person holding the brush. Moments were interpreted, not captured. Beauty was filtered through imagination. History was frozen only through artistic interpretation. If a loved one died, the only way to remember their face was through a painted portrait or a sketch, assuming one could afford such a luxury. If travelers visited distant lands, they returned home with descriptions, not photos. Descriptions changed with time. Memories blurred. This was a world desperately in need of permanence. Science, however, was beginning to look at light differently. The Enlightenment had sparked curiosity about physics, chemistry, and the nature of vision itself. Researchers studied how light behaved, how the human eye perceived it, and how certain chemicals reacted to it. Several early experiments suggested that light could darken certain materials, such as silver salts, but no one had yet figured out how to fix these darkened shapes, how to stop them from fading back into blankness. The idea of capturing light permanently still seemed fantastical, almost impossible, but curiosity was growing. Scientists, inventors, and artists all began to wonder the same question. Could nature draw its own pictures? Among those dreamers was a quiet, meticulous Frenchman named Joseph Nicephore Niepce. At first glance, he did not seem destined to change the world. He was not famous, not wealthy, not a professional scientist. He was simply a deeply curious man who had spent years thinking about how sunlight could be harnessed. He studied optics, lenses, and chemistry from books. He tinkered with strange mixtures in his kitchen. He was fascinated by how light interacted with surfaces. He believed, long before anyone else, that light itself might be able to paint. But the world he lived in had no patience for such an idea. The concept was too abstract, too untested, too far ahead of its time. People understood painting. They respected artistry. But a machine that could capture reality without a hand guiding it, that seemed to challenge the very nature of art. Yet Niepce persisted quietly, like a man following a whisper only he could hear. The world before photography was also a world of stillness, a world with far slower rhythms than today. People walked instead of drove. Letters took days or weeks to arrive. Life unfolded gradually, like the slow spreading of sunlight through a window at dawn. This environment, peaceful and unhurried, provided Niepce with the patience required for his painstaking experiments. He could spend entire afternoons watching how sunlight moved across metal plates. He could leave chemical mixtures drying for hours without interruption. He could let his thoughts roam freely from one hypothesis to the next in a small room overlooking the fields of Burgundy. Long before photography existed, Niepce lived a life that prepared him for it. Quiet, observant, contemplative. The world around him, undefined by images, inspired him to imagine a way to preserve the things he saw. The open courtyard, the stable, the family garden, the roofs warmed by sunlight, the shadows stretching in opposite directions throughout the day. In a world where memory was fragile and drawings were imprecise, Niepce dreamed of permanence. He dreamed of capturing the real world exactly as it appeared, not remembering it, not interpreting it, capturing it. And in this silent, imaginous world, long before cameras became common, long before photography reshaped humanity, Niepce took his first steps toward a discovery that would change everything. A discovery that would begin with one photograph and a window. Section 2. The Man Who Captured Light. The Strange Life of Joseph Nicephore Niepce. Before the first photograph was ever created, before cameras existed, And long before anyone understood how light might permanently stain a surface, there lived a quiet man in the French countryside who spent most of his life chasing something no one else could see. His name was Joseph Nicephore Niepce, and although he would eventually reshape the world with a single image, almost no one noticed him while he was alive. His story is both tender and peculiar, the story of a dreamer who was certain that light itself could become a memory. Niepce was born in 1765 in a quiet region of France dotted with vineyards and old stone homes. From the beginning, he seemed slightly out of step with the ordinary concerns of his neighbors. While other children focused on the rhythms of farm work and family trade, Niepce was fascinated by the way sunlight spilled across surfaces, how it shifted as clouds passed, how reflections danced on water, how shadows stretched like growing creatures toward dusk. He was someone who observed life at a slower, quieter pace, noticing details most people rushed past. His family hoped he would pursue a respectable career, and for a time he tried. He joined the French army, served during the Revolution, worked in government, and even collaborated with his brother in an attempt to build an early internal combustion engine. But every profession he stepped into eventually fell away because something deeper called to him, an urge to study the natural world with an unusual patience. He wasn't an artist, not in the traditional sense, but he envied painters. He envied their ability to freeze a moment, to place reality onto a canvas with pigments and skilled fingers. Yet Niepce himself couldn't paint. His hand wasn't steady enough, his mind too restless for the measured techniques of artistry. Still, he longed to capture the beauty around him, and that longing slowly grew into a question. Could light paint a picture by itself without a human hand? This question became the quiet engine of his life. While his neighbors tended to orchards, or repaired roofs, or traded goods in the village, Niepce filled notebooks with theories, sketches, and chemical experiments. His workshop smelled constantly of lavender oil, solvents, and the metallic tang of pewter plates. He would sit for hours beside a window, watching how shadows shifted, imagining how these gentle patterns might be preserved. The era he lived in was one of curiosity. Scientists were discovering gases, minerals, new forms of electricity. But even among these pioneers, Niepce's obsession seemed strange. People knew that certain substances darkened when exposed to sunlight, but no one imagined that this fading and staining could be controlled, let alone shaped into a picture. Niepce believed it could. He began experimenting with a variety of materials. Bitumen of Judea, a naturally occurring asphalt, fascinated him. When light touched it, its surface hardened. When removed from light, it softened. What if, Niepce wondered, light could harden parts of the bitumen, while the shaded parts remained soft enough to be washed away? Would an image appear? Would light carve the world onto a plate the same way an artist etched lines with a needle? He tried and failed, tried and failed again. Days turned into months. months into years. His hair began to gray. His health began to weaken. Yet every morning he returned to his workshop, adjusting formulas, polishing metal plates, mixing solutions with the devotion of a monk crafting illuminated manuscripts. Many of his neighbors considered him eccentric. Some believed he was wasting his life on impossible ideas. Others whispered that he spent too much time alone. They did not understand that he wasn't escaping life. He was observing it with uncommon tenderness, trying to preserve the fleeting magic everyone else overlooked. His experiments grew more elaborate. He constructed a camera obscura, a wooden box used by artists to project an image of the outside world onto a flat interior surface. Painters had used these devices for centuries as drawing aids, but Niepce believed the box could do something more miraculous: permanently trap its own image. During the summer months, he placed a pewter plate coated with bitumen inside the camera and pointed it toward the window of his estate, toward a courtyard filled with barns, trees, and sunlight. He positioned the plate early in the morning. Then he waited. Hours passed. Entire days passed. The exposure was painfully slow. The bitumen changed only with the faintest encouragement. Niepce checked the plate obsessively, adjusting the angle, repositioning the camera, refining the mixture. At night, he sat at his desk by candlelight, writing down each observation in careful script. He was meticulous, methodical, patient beyond what most people could endure. And gradually, almost imperceptibly, something began to happen. The bitumen hardened where the light was strongest. The darker areas stayed soft. After days of exposure, Niepce washed the plate with lavender oil. What remained astonished him: a ghostly but unmistakable image. Buildings, a roof, a tree, light and shadow exactly as the world had cast them. It was the first photograph in human history. He called his method heliography, meaning writing with the sun. And yet, when he achieved this breathtaking breakthrough, there was no celebration, no recognition, no awards. Niepce lived in obscurity, far from cities and intellectual circles. He wrote letters to scientific societies, hoping to share his findings, but most ignored him. Photography did not yet exist as a concept. People didn't understand why such a discovery mattered. Still, he persisted. He refined his techniques, collaborated later with Louis Daguerre, and pushed the world quietly toward a revolution that would reshape everything: art, communication, memory, history itself. But throughout it all, Niepce remained humble. He didn't seek fame. He didn't crave praise. He just wanted to preserve the world as it was: light falling on rooftops, the angle of a shadow, the curve of a distant horizon. In a time when life was fragile, brief, and uncertain, he wanted something to last. Even as his health worsened, he continued working in silence, believing his most important breakthroughs were still ahead. But he died before the world realized what he had given it. Only much later did historians uncover how profound his contribution truly was. Today, when we take a photo with a phone in a fraction of a second, We are touching the legacy of a man who once waited days for light to whisper its story onto metal. A man who believed that the sun could remember. Section 3. The Man Behind the Lens. Niepce's quiet, unshakable obsession. Before photography became something ordinary, before it filled albums, phones, news feeds, and memories, there was a single man who pursued it with a level of determination most would have called unreasonable. Joseph Nicephore Niepce did not set out to become famous, nor did he create with the expectation that others would recognize the magnitude of his work. In fact, he spent most of his life in gentle obscurity, living far from Parisian intellectual circles, tucked instead into the peaceful countryside of Saint-Loup-de-Varennes. And yet, it was precisely this quiet environment that shaped the man who would change the world. Niepce had a personality both restless and serene. Restless in his desire to understand the world, serene in his patience for the slow, careful work of experimentation. Unlike artists driven by emotional storms or scientists known for theatrical discoveries, Niepce moved through life with understated curiosity. He listened more than he spoke. He observed more than he proclaimed. And he always worked in silence, as if noise itself might disrupt the fragile dialogue between his ideas and his materials. Long before he dreamed of capturing light, Niepce explored other inventions. He was fascinated by movement, pressure, and mechanical processes. He attempted to create engines far ahead of his time, devices using air pressure and controlled explosions, concepts that would eventually become essential in fields he never lived to see. None of these early inventions gained the recognition he hoped for, but they shaped the way he thought. They taught him that breakthroughs did not arrive in equal steps. They arrived unpredictably, appearing suddenly after long stretches of stagnation. He lived with a sense of gentle urgency, not anxious or rushed, but deeply aware that time was moving forward and ideas needed nurturing. His household, though modest, became a sanctuary for his work. Tools were always within arm's reach. Papers covered in scribbles of calculations lay on desks and shelves. Bottles of chemicals sat near open windows for ventilation. Even the outdoor courtyard became part of his experimental world, acting as a canvas for the light he was trying to tame. Despite the quiet nature of his environment, Niepce's inner world was loud with wonder. He often gazed at the fields beyond his home, mesmerized by how morning sunlight soaked the earth in one texture, while late afternoon light seemed to soften the very shape of objects. Shadows fascinated him just as much as brightness. The way a rooftop cast a triangular silhouette onto the courtyard struck him as something meaningful, something almost alive. In these small, everyday observations, most people saw nothing remarkable. Niepce saw potential. He saw a puzzle worth spending years of his life solving. His family, supportive yet puzzled by his dedication, watched him work through long days and longer nights. They knew he was chasing something that existed only in his imagination, but they also knew that he could not be dissuaded. Even when his experiments failed, he carried himself with the same calm demeanor, as if each failure contained a hidden instruction. He never allowed disappointment to overwhelm him. Instead, he used it as fuel. There was always another idea to test, another material to mix, another plate to prepare. His greatest struggle, however, was not technical. It was personal. Niepce's health began to decline, slowly but noticeably. He suffered from fatigue, tremors, and a general sense that his energy no longer matched his ambition. Days that once felt expansive became smaller, narrower, and more difficult to navigate. But even as his body weakened, his mind stayed sharp. It was as though the fading of his physical strength made him cling even more fiercely to his dream. Every exposure he attempted, every plate he prepared, felt like a small fight against time itself. Working with light was an unpredictable endeavor, and Niepce had to accept that much of his success depended on forces beyond his control. The weather could ruin weeks of preparation. A cloudy afternoon could steal hours of potential exposure time. A sudden gust of wind might shake his camera box and distort the image forming inside it. The world outside did not change its behavior to accommodate his experiments. But Niepce never allowed frustration to take root. He believed that persistence could overcome unpredictability, and somehow that belief sustained him. He also understood something important that few inventors of his era acknowledged. Patience is not passive. Patience is an active state of mind, a decision made repeatedly. While his plate sat for days gathering sunlight, Niepce used that waiting time to think deeply. He reevaluated his previous attempts, refined the way he mixed his chemicals, adjusted his handling techniques, and imagined new ways to improve the clarity of his images. The long exposures were not empty stretches, they were seasons of preparation. Despite working in isolation, Niepce was not disconnected from the wider world of ideas. He exchanged letters with other thinkers, read scientific journals when he could acquire them, and followed advancements in optics and chemistry. He was particularly fascinated by the growing interest in lenses and magnification. The idea that glass could manipulate light had always interested him, and he wondered how lenses might one day play a role in creating even clearer images. But for the moment, he had to use the simple tools he already possessed and trust that his intuition was guiding him correctly. There was a gentle humility in the way Niepce carried his ambition. He did not seek applause. He sought understanding. He wanted to share his discovery, not for glory, but because he believed the world would benefit from a new way of preserving reality. Paintings were beautiful, but they required interpretation. Drawings captured the world through the artist's hand. But a photograph, if such a thing could truly exist, would let people see the world exactly as it was, untouched by imagination or error. As the idea grew stronger inside him, Niepce found himself increasingly captivated by the thought of giving humanity a new way to remember, a new way to record, a new way to observe. He imagined travelers documenting landscapes far from home, families preserving portraits of loved ones, scientists recording the movement of stars. He sensed that photography, though still undeveloped and fragile, had the potential to change how humans interacted with their surroundings. In the quiet corners of his mind, Niepce also carried a faint hope that his work would one day matter to someone beyond himself. He wanted his efforts to stand as proof that small lives can hold great impact, that a single moment of insight in a small rural room could ripple through centuries. And even though he would never fully witness how photography transformed the world, he continued his work with the gentle certainty that he was creating something meaningful. He did not chase fame. He chased possibility, and in that pursuit, he became one of history's most quietly influential figures, an inventor whose name would one day sit beside the birth of an entire art form. Section 4. The Chemical Alchemy of Light. Experiments that changed everything. There is something almost poetic about the idea that photography, a medium so deeply connected to clarity and realism, was born through a process that resembled ancient alchemy. Niepce entered this world of experimentation not with the confidence of a trained chemist, but with the curiosity of someone who simply refused to look away from a problem that fascinated him. He understood that if light could leave a trace, then there must be a substance capable of receiving it. This became the heart of his search, a quest to find the one material that would respond to sunlight the way paper responds to ink. The earliest attempts were humble and filled with trial and error. Niepce gathered substances that darkened when exposed to sunlight and tried to control that darkening in a deliberate way. Some materials reacted too quickly, others too slowly, and many did not react at all. He tested powders, oils, minerals, even vegetation extracts. Anything that hinted, even faintly, at sensitivity to light was carefully examined. Yet nothing seemed consistent enough to produce a reliable image. He realized that what he needed was not just a material that reacted to light. He needed a material that hardened in its presence, something that would allow bright areas to become more solid while shaded areas remained soft. This contrast between firmness and softness would allow the resulting image to hold its shape. Through countless mixtures, failures, and small discoveries, Niepce eventually turned his attention to a substance used in printing and engravings, bitumen of Judea. Bitumen was a thick, tar-like material, ancient in origin and known for its ability to harden under prolonged exposure to sunlight. At first, Niepce tested it as one of many possibilities, expecting little from it. But what happened next surprised even him. When he coated a surface with a thin layer of bitumen, exposed it to light, and then washed it with oil of lavender, the areas touched by sunlight remained hardened while the darker areas dissolved away. Slowly, faintly, a pattern emerged, an imprint sculpted not by hand but by the sun. This was the breakthrough he had been seeking, though he understood immediately that it was far from perfect. The exposure time was unbelievably long, and the images lacked clarity. But the concept was sound. For the first time, Niepce witnessed the world drawing itself. It was the kind of moment inventors dream of, the moment when an impossible idea suddenly becomes tangible. Still, Niepce did not celebrate loudly. He approached the discovery with that same quiet humility that had guided him all his life. Instead of declaring victory, he returned to his workbench with renewed determination, aware that the path ahead remained steep. Every experiment began with preparing the plate, and this preparation was an art form in itself. Niepce worked meticulously, polishing pewter plates until they reflected light like soft mirrors. He applied the bitumen mixture in even strokes, making sure the coating was neither too thick nor too thin. He learned quickly that the slightest inconsistency could transform the final image. A streak could distort a shadow. A thick patch could block the finer details. These delicate steps demanded patience, patience Niepce possessed in abundance. Because the bitumen responded slowly to light, exposure times became a central challenge. Niepce had to wait, not minutes, but hours. Sometimes entire days passed before he knew whether an experiment succeeded or failed. This waiting required a mindset few people could endure. It was not simply a matter of leaving the plate outside. It was a matter of trusting that nature would cooperate. He had to hope the sunlight would remain strong, that clouds would not drift across the sky, that wind would not shake the camera box even slightly. The process required surrender as much as control. In those long periods of waiting, Niepce often found himself standing at the window, watching the landscape with the same attentiveness that first inspired him. He studied the way the roofs glowed under different angles of sunlight. He traced the movement of shadows across the courtyard. These observations were not idle. They were part of his work. To understand how light would etch itself onto his plates, he needed to understand how light behaved moment by moment. Nature became both his collaborator and his teacher. When the exposure time was finally complete, the true test began. Niepce brought the plate back inside and carefully bathed it in the solvent. He watched as the bitumen dissolved from the shaded areas, revealing the image beneath. It must have been an experience filled with both tension and wonder, like watching a secret slowly reveal itself. Some plates showed only irregular patches, others faint outlines, and a few displayed promising forms. Each result, whether successful or disappointing, brought him closer to refining the technique. His notebooks from this time were filled with observations that read almost like the thoughts of a poet disguised as a scientist. He wrote about the behavior of shadows, the subtle differences between morning and evening light, the changes in temperature and humidity, and how each one influenced the exposure. He noted the fragility of his materials, the ways in which a slightly warmer day could alter the entire process. These little entries reveal a mind deeply attuned to the rhythm of nature and the delicacy of creation. As he continued experimenting, Niepce began refining not only the chemical mixture, but also the tools involved. His wooden camera obscura, equipped with simple lenses, became a trusted companion. He adjusted the aperture to control light intensity, experimented with different focal lengths, and learned how distance influenced the clarity of the final image. He treated his equipment not as objects, but as familiar extensions of his hands and mind. One of the most striking aspects of Niepce's work was how alone he was in this endeavor. Not alone in a sad or isolating way, but alone in the sense that no one else was walking precisely the same path. Photography did not exist yet. There were no experts to consult, no textbooks to read, no laboratories dedicated to this strange new pursuit. Every step he took was one step into a landscape without maps, and yet he embraced this solitude with grace, knowing that discovery often sprouts in the quiet corners where few others look. He faced setbacks, of course, countless ones. Plates warped unexpectedly, mixtures separated. Chemical reactions behaved unpredictably. Some images faded quickly after development, as though the light that created them was reluctant to remain captured. But these obstacles did not discourage him. Instead, each one reinforced his belief that the problem was solvable. He saw failures not as dead ends, but as signposts pointing toward new adjustments. Through all these trials, a vision remained clear in his mind. He imagined a world where light could be preserved, where moments no longer drifted away as memories, but solidified into something lasting. It was this vision that sustained him during the slow, methodical work, guiding his hands even when results seemed uncertain. And so Niepce continued refining his process, quietly, patiently, and with unwavering devotion. Each experiment brought him closer to the invention that would one day shape how humanity remembers its own story. Section 5. The early mornings at Niepce's estate were unlike any ordinary day. Mist lingered over the fields like a silver veil, softening the edges of the world and turning familiar structures into shadowed silhouettes. He would often walk through the garden, lantern in hand, taking note of the subtle changes in the light, the way the sun broke through the clouds, and the way reflections danced on the surfaces of dew-laden leaves. It was in these quiet hours that he found inspiration, the gentle whisper of possibility stirring in his mind. Every corner of his surroundings seemed to hold potential for his experiments. The angles of sunlight across a fence post, the sheen of water in the small ponds, even the patterns of frost in winter, which he observed with meticulous care. It was a world alive with subtle movement, delicate and intricate, a universe waiting to be captured. Niepce's invention, the heliograph, demanded patience that tested the limits of human endurance. Working with metal plates coated in bitumen of Judea, he faced the constant uncertainty of whether the day's attempt would succeed or yield only frustration. The chemical composition was volatile, sometimes too sensitive to light, sometimes resistant, and yet each failure taught him something profound about the interaction between light and material. He began to anticipate the subtleties of exposure, the shifts in intensity over the course of a day, and the effect of shadows stretching across the landscape. It was a slow, meditative process where hours could pass in the quiet company of his thoughts and the gentle sounds of the estate, birdsong, rustling leaves, the distant clatter of carts on the road. Emotions intertwined with this meticulous labor. There were days when despair pressed upon him, a weight that felt physical, when the images he tried to create dissolved into streaks or faded patches. He questioned whether the endeavor was worth the strain, whether the world would ever understand the significance of capturing light itself. Yet alongside the doubts, there was also a flicker of exhilaration, a spark of hope that whispered in the corners of his consciousness. If only the exposure were right. If only the chemistry aligned perfectly with the natural rhythms of the sun, he might glimpse the unseen world that lay just beyond ordinary perception. This oscillation between despair and hope became a rhythm of its own, an emotional cadence intertwined with the practical rhythm of his experiments. His relationship with his tools was almost intimate. The camera obscura, a simple wooden box with a tiny lens, became an extension of his perception. He learned to see through it not just as a mechanical device, but as a partner in revelation, capable of translating the ephemeral qualities of light and shadow into something lasting. Adjusting the angle, observing the effect of diffused or direct sunlight, he treated every minor alteration as a note in a symphony, a subtle change that could reveal truths hidden from ordinary sight. The metal plates, polished and coated with care, were his canvas, and the sun its brush. It was an interplay of control and surrender. He could manipulate certain variables, but ultimately, the sun decided the outcome, a cosmic collaborator whose generosity was sometimes fleeting. Beyond the technical and emotional challenges, the surrounding landscape played an indispensable role. The rolling hills, fields, and hedgerows of Niepce's estate were more than scenery. They were collaborators in his experiment. He would observe the patterns of light over stone walls, the reflections of water catching the sun, the shifting hues of dawn and dusk, and he began to notice that even the atmosphere itself influenced the clarity and depth of the images he could produce. Weather was no longer a backdrop, but an active participant. Fog, rain, wind, each brought unpredictable variables, forcing him to adapt, anticipate, and experiment. In this, he found a strange comfort, a rhythm to the unpredictability that mirrored the unpredictability of his own mind, full of ideas that moved and shifted, some fleeting, some persistent. Isolation became a double-edged sword. While it offered the peace required for focus and reflection, it also magnified the weight of his ambitions and fears. Niepce's work was unseen by the wider world, a private dialogue between him and the elements, the chemicals, the light. In this solitude, imagination and reality intertwined. He envisioned a future where images could exist independently of the human hand, where landscapes, buildings, and faces could be captured exactly as they were, frozen in a moment of time. Yet in these same hours, the isolation sometimes gave rise to profound self-doubt. Would history remember him, or would his work dissolve into obscurity, like the fleeting mists he so often observed in the morning? These reflections, heavy with the weight of possibility, fueled both frustration and determination. Niepce's emotional journey was mirrored in his experiment's physical rhythms. Days often began before dawn, when the air was crisp and still, and stretched into long afternoons, punctuated by careful observation and note-taking. Each failure became a lesson in patience. He documented meticulously, noting not just the technical adjustments, but the effects of changing light angles, atmospheric conditions, and even the time of year. These records were both scientific and poetic, blending the objective with the subjective. It was as though he was writing a diary, not just of experiments, but of lived experience, of moments of awe and quiet revelation in the natural world. Yet, even amidst this intense focus, Niepce allowed moments of wonder. A single shaft of sunlight illuminating a dew-drenched leaf could elicit awe, a reminder that his work was not merely mechanical, but deeply entwined with beauty. The estate itself seemed to breathe around him, and he moved through it with reverence, attuned to subtleties most would overlook. Every gust of wind, every changing shadow became a teacher, offering insight into the behavior of light, and by extension, the potential of his heliographs. This attentiveness was both spiritual and practical, a meditation that simultaneously nourished his creativity and advanced his technical skill. By the end of many such days, Niepce would retreat indoors as the sun dipped below the horizon, exhausted but quietly exhilarated. The images produced might be faint, incomplete, or imperfect, but they were tangible results of his engagement with the world, reflections of both his intellect and his sensitivity to the environment around him. In these moments, he recognized that invention was as much about patience, observation, and emotional resilience as it was about technical knowledge. The process itself was a dialogue between mind, material, and nature, a delicate balance that required attentiveness, humility, and unyielding curiosity. Section 5, then, is a portrait of Niepce not merely as an inventor, but as a man intertwined with his environment, his tools, and his emotional landscape. The interplay of light, chemistry, and human perseverance created a rhythm unique to him, one in which failure and revelation were inseparable, and in which the quiet details of the natural world were both inspiration and collaborator. Each day was a meditation, an experiment in seeing and understanding, a step toward capturing the ephemeral beauty of life itself in a permanent, unyielding image. Section 6. The early mornings of Niepce's estate were silent in a way that seemed almost sacred. As the sun crept over the horizon, its first rays brushed gently across the fields, and the world appeared as if newly born. This quiet was a perfect companion for his work, allowing him to enter a state of deep focus where the boundary between thought and observation blurred. In these moments, he was not merely experimenting with chemicals and metal plates. He was engaging in a dialogue with light itself, attempting to translate its ephemeral qualities into something permanent. Each day brought new lessons, new subtleties to notice, and new variables to manage, from the angle of the sun to the moisture in the air. Niepce's techniques had evolved since his earliest experiments. He had learned that the bitumen of Judea, when spread thinly across a metal plate, would harden in proportion to its exposure to light. But it was not a straightforward process. Overexposure would bleach out the details, leaving a faint impression of shapes, rather than the crisp outlines he desired. Underexposure would fail to capture the nuances of light and shadow, resulting in dark, undefined smudges. Achieving balance required both patience and intuition, a dance between scientific knowledge and a poet's sensibility. Niepce began to see patterns in the changing light of the day. Understanding when certain angles would produce the richest contrasts or reveal hidden textures in the landscape. The estate itself became a vast canvas for his experiments. He moved through it with careful observation, noting how light fell across the roof of his barn, the curve of the garden walls, and the gentle ripples of water in the ponds. Each element offered a different lesson in perspective, composition, and exposure. He discovered that distant objects often appeared softer, their outlines blending with the air, while objects nearby could reveal astonishing detail. Trees, fences, rooftops, and even the rough texture of stone pathways became more than mere scenery. They were collaborators in his quest to capture reality. Niepce's sensitivity to these nuances marked him as both artist and scientist, blending technical precision with aesthetic awareness. Emotional resilience was as critical to his work as technical skill. The long exposures required by the heliograph often meant that hours passed without certainty that the day's attempt would succeed. Niepce faced frequent disappointment, watching plates that should have contained clear images emerge blurred or uneven. Yet with each failure, he gained insight. He began to document not only the results, but also the conditions, the quality of light at different hours, the orientation of the camera obscura, subtle differences in the application of bitumen. These detailed records became a treasure trove of information, guiding future experiments and allowing him to refine his methods systematically. The interplay of trial, error, and observation was itself a meditation, a rhythm that structured his days. Niepce's awareness extended beyond the physical environment to the passage of time. He noticed how shadows lengthened and shifted across the estate as the sun arced across the sky, and he began to time his exposures accordingly. Early morning and late afternoon light produced soft contrasts, while the harsh midday sun sometimes obliterated delicate details. Weather, too, played a crucial role. Clouds diffused the light, sometimes providing even illumination, while sudden rain could alter the reflective quality of surfaces, introducing new variables. Each day was unique, a complex system of interdependent factors that demanded careful observation and flexible adaptation. The technical challenges of preparing the plates were equally intricate. Niepce experimented with varying thicknesses of bitumen, discovering that slight alterations could dramatically affect the final image. He refined his chemical knowledge, testing the solubility of hardened areas against unexposed surfaces, and he began to appreciate the delicate chemistry that transformed sunlight into a fixed image. The process was fragile. Any misstep could ruin a plate entirely, but these risks heightened the sense of discovery. Each successful exposure was a small triumph, a fleeting glimpse into the possibility of capturing time itself in a tangible form. Isolation continued to shape his experience. Without the distraction of contemporary society or the input of collaborators, Niepce's mind could wander freely, exploring connections between observation, experimentation, and imagination. He visualized a future where images could exist independently of human memory, where the world might be preserved in its visual form for generations to come. These contemplations were tinged with both ambition and humility. He understood that his work was only a first step in a much larger journey. The notion that light could be harnessed and recorded felt almost miraculous, a profound intersection of nature, science, and art. Despite the solitude, Niepce remained deeply attuned to the life around him. Birds moved silently through the garden, their shadows dancing across the plates. The wind stirred leaves in rhythmic patterns. Distant animals grazed in fields that would later appear on his exposed surfaces. He observed these interactions with keen attention, recognizing that even subtle movement could affect the clarity of an image. This attentiveness required patience and discipline, a willingness to wait for the perfect alignment of light and subject. The world, in its quiet and ordinary beauty, became both teacher and partner. In the evenings, after the plates had developed, Niepce would review his results carefully. The faint impressions on metal revealed subtle details of structure, texture, and shadow that had been invisible to the naked eye. Some images captured a surprising clarity, rendering the intricate lattice of window panes, the delicate lines of fences, and even the unevenness of cobblestones. Other images remained ghostly, their outlines blurred, but even failures provided insight into the interaction of light, material, and exposure. Each plate was a lesson, a step closer to the elusive goal of fully capturing the world's visual essence, emotionally. These successes and failures were profound. Niepce experienced moments of exhilaration when the image materialized, a tangible proof of his vision. But he also endured moments of despair when the light had been insufficient, the bitumen improperly applied, or an unforeseen factor had intervened. The oscillation between hope and disappointment became a constant companion, shaping not only his work, but his character. Through these experiences, he developed a resilience and patience that were integral to both his scientific approach and his aesthetic sensibility. By the close of day, Niepce often lingered in contemplation. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold, and he reflected on the fleeting moments captured by his plates. Though imperfect, each image was a testament to his dedication and to the subtle interplay of light, chemistry, and observation. In these quiet reflections, he understood that invention was as much about persistence, attentiveness, and emotional engagement as it was about technical expertise. His work was not merely a mechanical process. It was an intimate conversation with the world itself. Section 6 thus portrays Niepce as both meticulous scientist and contemplative observer, deeply attuned to the world around him. The daily rituals of observation, exposure, and development created a rhythm that intertwined practical experimentation with emotional and philosophical reflection. Each day's work was a delicate balance of patience, resilience, and discovery, advancing not only his technical achievements, but also his understanding of perception, light, and time. It was in this delicate interplay of nature, chemistry, and imagination that the heliograph began to take shape, laying the groundwork for a revolution in human visual experience. Section 7. The days at Niepce's estate were beginning to carry a new intensity. After years of careful experimentation, he had begun to understand not just the mechanics of capturing light, but the delicate rhythm of patience and timing required to coax it onto a plate. Section 7 of his journey delves deeply into this crucial phase, when theory and practice began to converge, and the elusive promise of permanent images seemed within reach. Niepce had long observed that different surfaces reflected light in unique ways, and that these reflections could drastically affect the clarity of his heliographs. Early experiments with polished metal had taught him that a smooth surface could produce a sharper image, but required a precise chemical balance to prevent the bitumen from peeling or over-hardening. Conversely, slightly rougher surfaces allowed the bitumen to adhere more consistently, but sometimes introduced a granular texture that blurred finer details. Over time, Niepce had developed a sensitivity to these subtleties, understanding that the canvas for his images was as important as the chemical and optical processes he employed. Each surface, each plate, was a partner in an intricate dance with light. The timing of exposures had become another focal point. Niepce experimented with days of varying sunlight, noting the shifting intensity of morning, midday, and afternoon light. He had discovered that the fleeting moments, when clouds partially diffused the sunlight, often yielded the most nuanced images, balancing contrast without washing out details. Early morning sun brought soft, elongated shadows that accentuated texture, while the low afternoon light added depth and a gentle warmth that seemed to enhance the tonal richness of the plate. These observations required patience and an almost meditative attention to the subtle changes in the environment, a rhythm that made his work feel less like a mechanical process and more like a dialogue with nature itself. As Niepce refined his techniques, the chemistry of his process demanded constant attention. The bitumen of Judea, sensitive to light in a precise manner, had to be applied with uniformity across the plate. Too thick a layer, and it resisted exposure, flattening the image into a shadowy haze. Too thin, and it became brittle, fragmenting during development. Niepce had learned to observe the bitumen under different lighting conditions, to feel its texture with practiced fingers, and to make minute adjustments that would dramatically alter the outcome. These adjustments required not only skill, but also intuition, a trust in his observations, and a willingness to experiment within the delicate boundaries of chemistry and light. The camera obscura, his primary tool for directing light onto the plate, also demanded attention. Niepce experimented with angles, distances, and lens adjustments, discovering that even minor shifts could influence the final image. The interplay of focal length and exposure time became a complex equation that he approached both mathematically and aesthetically. Sometimes, he would adjust the plate's position within the device by mere millimeters, yet the resulting differences in the heliograph were profound. The smallest variables, the tilt of a roof, the curve of a garden wall, the shadow of a fence post, could transform an image from vague outlines into a scene of startling clarity. Each successful exposure taught him more about the precision necessary to capture the world faithfully. Emotionally, this period was intense. The years of effort had cultivated both anticipation and anxiety. Every plate that emerged from the developing process brought with it a rush of hope, tempered by a lifetime of near misses. Niepce's resilience was tested daily. The line between triumph and frustration was thin. Yet, it was in these moments of tension that his genius thrived. The uncertainty demanded careful observation, iterative experimentation, and a willingness to embrace failure as a teacher. Niepce had begun to understand that each misstep revealed crucial information about the nature of light, chemical interactions, and material surfaces, a complex puzzle that slowly began to reveal its underlying patterns. At the same time, Niepce's aesthetic sensibility matured alongside his technical expertise. He began to see potential images not just as scientific experiments, but as compositions with depth, contrast, and rhythm. Shadows became lines that guided the eye. The curve of a rooftop suggested perspective. The rough texture of a path hinted at tactile reality. He started to arrange his exposures with an awareness of visual storytelling, anticipating the way an observer might experience the image. The heliograph, he realized, was not merely a record of light, but a medium through which the subtle poetry of the world could be communicated. It was a blending of precision and artistry that foreshadowed photography as both science and art. Niepce's estate itself seemed alive with possibility. Every tree, pond, and building became part of a living laboratory. Birds moving through the garden cast fleeting shadows that, if captured correctly, added a sense of life and movement to the plates. Leaves fluttered, water rippled, and sunlight shifted, all contributing to the delicate interplay between stillness and motion. Each exposure required careful timing, often waiting for moments when the world aligned perfectly with his vision. The challenge was immense, but the rewards were subtle yet profound, images that captured the texture, light, and vitality of a single moment in time. This section of his journey also reveals Niepce's philosophical reflections. He began to contemplate the deeper implications of his work, imagining a future in which visual memory could be preserved indefinitely. He envisioned a world where images could communicate not only the appearance of objects, but the very essence of a moment, its light, atmosphere, and texture. These reflections imbued his experiments with a sense of purpose beyond mere technical achievement. Each plate became a bridge between the transient nature of reality and the permanence he sought to create. By the end of this period, Niepce had achieved a level of mastery that allowed him to combine patience, observation, chemical skill, and aesthetic judgment in unprecedented ways. The results were not yet perfect, but they represented a profound shift from experimentation to creation. The heliographs now began to capture subtle details, textures, lines, and tonal gradations that had previously eluded him. Shadows were defined, structures were clear, and the images carried an uncanny sense of realism that suggested the possibility of a new visual language. The horizon of photography had begun to emerge, shaped by decades of meticulous work, patience, and vision. Section 7 thus highlights the turning point in Niepce's work. It emphasizes his growing understanding of the environment, light, chemistry, and aesthetic composition, showing how each element interacted to produce the earliest permanent images. The convergence of science and art, experimentation and observation, patience and intuition, defined this critical stage, laying the groundwork for the historic success that would follow in subsequent years. Niepce was not merely inventing a process, he was discovering a new way of seeing the world, capturing its ephemeral beauty and translating it into permanence. Section 8. As Niepce's experiments progressed into this phase of his life, he entered a period where meticulous refinement and the subtleties of observation began to converge in profound ways. Section 8 explores how his growing mastery of light, chemicals, and materials coalesced into a near-complete understanding of how to permanently capture an image, a process that was as much about patience and timing as it was about scientific ingenuity. During this period, Niepce focused intensely on the interaction between sunlight and the surfaces he was attempting to photograph. He had learned that not all light was equal. Morning light, filtered through trees or diffused by clouds, cast soft shadows and revealed details that the harsher midday sun often washed out. Evening light, golden and long, added a depth and warmth that could imbue his images with a sense of time and atmosphere. He observed, with almost meditative attentiveness, how the intensity, angle, and quality of light changed over the course of a single day, making mental notes on how to adjust exposures for each type of light. These observations weren't merely technical. They revealed Niepce's emerging sensitivity to the poetic qualities of illumination, understanding that light could convey mood, texture, and depth simultaneously. Niepce's chemical experimentation also reached new heights. The bitumen of Judea, which had been central to his earlier experiments, required precise application and timing. He had discovered that variations in thickness dramatically affected the final image. A thicker coat resisted exposure, capturing only the most intense highlights while leaving subtler details faint or absent. A thinner layer, while more responsive, became brittle and prone to fragmentation during development. This delicate balance required intuition, a practiced eye, and repeated trial and error experimentation. Niepce meticulously prepared each plate, observing the behavior of the bitumen under different conditions, and carefully documenting the outcomes. Over time, he began to anticipate how subtle changes in temperature, humidity, and even the angle at which the plate was placed would influence the development process. The camera obscura remained Niepce's primary tool, but he was no longer content with simple exposures. He began to explore the subtleties of focus, lens curvature, and the distance between the plate and the lens. Small adjustments could dramatically alter the sharpness, contrast, and clarity of an image. Niepce observed that even minor tilts of the plate could affect how light interacted with the bitumen, producing unexpected patterns or distortions. These discoveries were painstaking, requiring hours of preparation and observation, but they gradually allowed him to control the nuances of his images with remarkable precision. A particularly fascinating aspect of this period was Niepce's experimentation with composition and perspective. Unlike previous years, when he primarily sought to capture static shapes or forms, he now considered the overall aesthetic impact of his images. Shadows, angles, and lines were no longer incidental. They became integral to the composition. The slope of a roof, the curve of a pathway, the placement of a fence, or the ripple of a pond were all elements that Niepce observed with an artist's eye. He began arranging exposures not just to record reality, but to communicate a sense of space, depth, and rhythm. Each image became a subtle orchestration of light and geometry, revealing both the external world and Niepce's inner perception of it. During this phase, the challenges of development were equally critical. Niepce discovered that once the exposure was complete, the process of washing and revealing the image required extraordinary care. Too vigorous a wash, and the delicate bitumen could strip away, erasing the image entirely. Too gentle and unexposed areas remained, obscuring fine details. He refined his approach with patience and intuition, developing techniques that allowed the image to emerge gradually, almost as if coaxing the latent photograph from its chemical slumber. These careful practices transformed each plate into more than a scientific experiment. They became enduring records of a specific moment in time, capturing details with an accuracy that was unprecedented. Niepce's focus on environmental observation was also remarkable. He noted how wind could ripple the surface of a pond, casting fleeting patterns that, if captured at the right moment, added dynamic texture to the image. Birds or small animals moving through a scene could create subtle motion, lending life to otherwise still compositions. He began to understand that photography was not merely about freezing an image, but about capturing the interplay of light, shadow, and motion, however delicate or fleeting. This awareness marked a crucial evolution in his thinking, moving from pure technical experimentation to a more holistic understanding of visual perception, emotionally and mentally. This period tested Niepce in ways he had never experienced before. Years of patient trial and error had cultivated both immense anticipation and frequent frustration. Each failed plate served as a lesson, revealing not just what went wrong, but offering clues to how subtle adjustments could improve future attempts. The balance between hope and disappointment became a daily rhythm, with moments of quiet triumph interspersed with long stretches of meticulous repetition. Yet, it was precisely this cycle of effort, observation, and adjustment that honed Niepce's skills and pushed him closer to the final breakthrough that would define his legacy. By the end of this period, Niepce had reached a level of mastery that allowed him to combine chemical precision, optical control, environmental awareness, and aesthetic sensitivity. The images he produced now displayed unprecedented clarity, subtle shading, and a tangible sense of depth. Shadows were nuanced, textures were distinct, and the overall composition conveyed a quiet, almost meditative beauty. Each plate represented not merely a scientific achievement, but an early form of artistry, capturing the fleeting qualities of light and environment in a way that had never been accomplished before. Section 8 highlights a turning point where the convergence of art and science became fully apparent. Niepce's work was no longer merely an exploration of chemical and optical phenomena. It had become a disciplined yet poetic engagement with the world. By combining meticulous experimentation, careful observation, and an intuitive sense of visual composition, he laid the foundation for the future of photography, moving beyond the constraints of theory into a domain where light, chemistry, and artistry could coexist harmoniously. Niepce's vision was now clearer than ever. He was capturing not only the appearance of reality, but its texture, depth, and atmosphere, bringing the promise of permanent images tantalizingly close. Section 9. As Niepce progressed into this next critical phase of his experiments, the process of capturing images had evolved into a delicate dance of observation, chemistry, and patience. By Section 9, his understanding of light, materials, and exposure had reached an unprecedented level of sophistication, allowing him to push the boundaries of what could be permanently recorded from the natural world. This section explores how he meticulously honed his techniques, navigating both technical challenges and the subtle artistry that would ultimately define his legacy. Niepce's mastery of light had become a central focus. He now fully appreciated that light was not a uniform force. It possessed variations in intensity, color, and direction that could transform the appearance of a scene. Early morning and late afternoon provided long, soft shadows that enhanced texture and depth, while midday light, though harsher, revealed crisp outlines and structural clarity. Niepce learned to adjust exposure times and the angle of his camera obscura accordingly, allowing him to selectively highlight elements of a scene. He even experimented with partially shading certain areas of the plate, subtly manipulating the interaction between light and bitumen to bring out nuanced details. These innovations demonstrated his growing sensitivity to the aesthetic possibilities of photography, showing that he was not merely recording reality, but beginning to interpret it. Chemical precision remained equally vital. Niepce had refined the use of bitumen of Judea to a near art form. He discovered that environmental factors such as temperature and humidity influenced how the bitumen reacted to light. On cold, damp days, longer exposures were necessary, while warmer, dry conditions allowed for shorter exposure times. He developed a keen intuition for these variables, often observing the weather and adjusting the plate's preparation accordingly. Each coat of bitumen was applied with meticulous care, the thickness calibrated to achieve the ideal balance between sensitivity and durability. Niepce's plates were no longer random experiments. They were carefully orchestrated compositions, each designed to capture the maximum amount of detail with minimal distortion. Beyond light and chemistry, Niepce began to experiment more deliberately with composition and perspective. He understood that the position of the camera, the angle of view, and the arrangement of objects within the frame could dramatically alter the impact of an image. Lines of rooftops, pathways, and fences were arranged to guide the viewer's eye, creating a sense of depth and movement, even in a still image. Natural elements, such as trees or ripples in water, were incorporated intentionally to enhance texture and visual rhythm. Niepce's approach demonstrated an early recognition of photography as both a scientific and artistic practice, blending empirical experimentation with an almost painterly sensitivity to form and light. Niepce also grappled with one of the most challenging aspects of his work: exposure time. Capturing a complete image required hours of sunlight falling on the plate, and even minor changes in weather could dramatically affect the final outcome. Clouds passing overhead or sudden shifts in atmospheric conditions could alter the intensity of light, sometimes ruining a plate entirely. Niepce developed meticulous timing techniques, often observing the sun's trajectory for weeks before selecting the optimal moment for exposure. He documented these patterns carefully, noting the behavior of light and shadow throughout the day and across different seasons. This discipline not only enhanced the technical quality of his plates, but also imbued them with a subtle temporal dimension, recording not just space, but a slice of time itself. Another significant development during this period was Niepce's understanding of chemical development. He had discovered that the bitumen's exposure to light created latent images that required careful washing and fixing to become permanent. He experimented with various solvents and methods, gradually identifying techniques that revealed the image without compromising its integrity. The process required an extraordinary degree of patience. A slight misstep in washing or handling could destroy hours of careful work. Yet, these trials allowed Niepce to perfect a system in which the image emerged gradually, as if coaxed into existence. This careful development process reflected not only scientific rigor, but also an intuitive sense of timing and rhythm, echoing his earlier attentiveness to the quality of light itself. Niepce's experiments were not isolated. He was in contact with other inventors and scientists of his time, exchanging ideas about optics, chemistry, and mechanical design. These interactions, though limited by the communication methods of the early 19th century, provided critical insights and occasional inspiration. He incorporated these external ideas selectively, always adapting them to his own methods and understanding. His approach was highly individualistic. While others explored theoretical concepts, Niepce's work was grounded in hands-on experimentation, direct observation, and patient trial and error. Emotionally, this period of Niepce's life was marked by a mixture of determination and quiet reflection. Years of painstaking experimentation had cultivated resilience. Each failure was a lesson, each success a cautious celebration. The long hours spent observing light, mixing chemicals, and adjusting plates became almost meditative, with the repetitive nature of his work fostering deep concentration and heightened awareness of the subtleties of his environment. Niepce's dedication exemplifies the interplay between scientific inquiry and artistic sensibility, revealing a mind attuned not only to the mechanics of photography, but to its potential as a medium for capturing the world's beauty and complexity. By the end of this phase, Niepce was poised on the brink of his most significant achievement. He had synthesized knowledge of light, chemistry, composition, and development into a coherent method capable of producing enduring images. These plates were no longer mere experiments. They were the precursors to modern photography, capturing the interplay of light and material with a precision and subtlety that had never been achieved before. Each image reflected hours of careful preparation, observation, and adjustment, embodying the convergence of technical mastery and aesthetic sensitivity. Section 9 underscores a critical moment in the history of photography, the point at which experimentation transcends technical trial and error and begins to embrace artistry. Niepce's work demonstrates that the earliest photographs were as much about understanding the natural world as they were about creating visual records of it. By harmonizing scientific precision with an almost poetic attentiveness to light and composition, Niepce brought the potential for permanent imagery tantalizingly close, laying the groundwork for the breakthrough that would soon define his legacy. Section 10. As Niepce entered this phase of his work, the quest to produce a reliable, permanent image had grown both technically complex and emotionally consuming. Section 10 explores the culmination of his meticulous experiments, the subtle refinements that distinguished his plates from mere chemical curiosities, and the profound patience and insight required to capture what would become the first surviving photograph. By now, Niepce had not only mastered the interaction between light and bitumen, but he was also beginning to understand the broader implications of his work, how a fleeting moment in time could be permanently frozen, creating a window into reality that had never existed before. Niepce's focus had shifted toward optimizing the sensitivity of his plates while minimizing imperfections. Previous experiments had revealed that uneven coating of bitumen or minor variations in exposure could drastically affect the outcome, creating blurred or partially invisible images. To address this, he experimented with layering the bitumen, applying one coat, letting it partially dry, and then adding a second to achieve uniform thickness. He discovered that the consistency of the bitumen mixture, its ratio of oil to resin, and the precise method of applying it with a brush or spatula all influenced the clarity of the final image. Each plate became a carefully crafted artifact, combining chemistry, dexterity, and intuition. exposure time remained a formidable challenge. Early trials had required several hours of direct sunlight, and even minor fluctuations in weather could compromise the plate. Niepce developed an intricate system of observation, tracking the movement of the sun and noting the subtle differences in its angle and intensity throughout the day. By timing the exposure precisely, he could maximize contrast and detail, allowing objects in the frame to be captured with a remarkable degree of fidelity. The process was painstaking. A single miscalculation could ruin an entire day's work. Yet, through repeated trials, Niepce began to anticipate the behavior of both light and bitumen, a testament to his patient, almost meditative approach. A particularly notable aspect of this period was Niepce's attention to perspective and composition. While many early experimenters focused solely on the technical capture of light and shadow, Niepce recognized the importance of arranging the scene to enhance both clarity and aesthetic appeal. He chose rooftops, fences, and distant landscapes that provided visual depth and rhythm. Lines converged to guide the eye, and elements such as windows, doors, and chimneys offered natural contrast points that highlighted the interaction between light and shadow. Niepce was creating more than images. He was developing a visual language that communicated both spatial organization and temporal presence, effectively laying the groundwork for photography as an expressive art form. Another critical refinement involved the chemical development process. Niepce had discovered that exposing the plate to light created a latent image within the hardened bitumen, which required careful treatment to reveal. He experimented with various solvents and washing techniques, gradually identifying methods that revealed the full detail of the scene without dissolving the delicate bitumen. This stage demanded extraordinary precision. Too much solvent would wash away essential details, while too little would leave faint images imperceptible to the eye. The development process became almost a ritual, each step executed with measured care and quiet concentration, highlighting Niepce's dual mastery of chemistry and patience. Niepce's work at this stage also reflected an understanding of environmental influences. Temperature, humidity, and even slight changes in sunlight intensity could affect the speed at which the bitumen reacted. He developed a nuanced approach, sometimes partially covering the plate or adjusting its angle to compensate for subtle shifts in light. This sensitivity to environmental conditions demonstrated not only his technical acumen, but also an intuitive connection with the natural world. Niepce's plates were, in essence, collaborative creations between human ingenuity and the forces of nature, capturing moments that were simultaneously scientific experiments and visual poetry. Beyond technical considerations, Niepce's emotional engagement with his work deepened. Years of trials, errors, and near successes had cultivated an extraordinary focus and resilience. Hours spent observing, coding, and exposing plates became a form of meditation, fostering a heightened awareness of detail and pattern. He reflected constantly on the interplay between patience and chance, understanding that the fleeting, unpredictable nature of light was both an obstacle and a creative partner. Each successful image was a profound reward, a tangible proof of the invisible processes he had meticulously orchestrated. By this point, Niepce was ready for the defining experiment that would secure his place in history. On a clear day, he positioned a plate inside his camera obscura, overlooking the courtyard of his estate. He carefully adjusted the angle to optimize shadow and highlight, prepared his bitumen with exacting precision, and commenced the prolonged exposure. For several hours, he monitored the process, observing the subtle changes in light, the movement of shadows, and the way textures appeared across rooftops and walls. Each detail of the environment became a variable in a delicate equation of light and chemical reaction. The result of this painstaking process was the world's first surviving photograph, a permanent image that captured not only the structures before him, but also the interplay of light and shadow at a precise moment in time. Every element of the scene, from the rooftops and chimneys to the subtle textures of the courtyard, was rendered with astonishing clarity, revealing the potential of photography to document reality with both accuracy and aesthetic sensitivity. Niepce had achieved what countless inventors had sought: the ability to fix light, transforming ephemeral visual impressions into enduring images. Section 10 thus represents a watershed moment in the history of photography. Niepce's mastery of light, chemistry, composition, and environmental factors culminated in a method capable of producing permanent images for the first time. His work transformed the very concept of observation, allowing humans to capture moments that could be studied, admired, and remembered indefinitely. The photograph was no longer a fleeting impression. It was a tangible record, a bridge between human perception and the immutable world. Niepce's dedication, precision, and intuitive understanding of both scientific and aesthetic principles set the stage for all future developments in photography. He demonstrated that technical skill alone was insufficient. The creation of enduring images required patience, artistry, and an intimate knowledge of the environment. Through these trials, he not only captured the world around him, but also captured the essence of discovery itself, a delicate balance between experimentation, observation, and the patient pursuit of innovation. Section 11. The Legacy of Niepce and the Dawn of a New Visual Age. By the time Niepce completed his groundbreaking photograph, he had unknowingly crossed a threshold that would permanently alter the way humanity experiences reality. Section 11 explores how his achievement reverberated far beyond his quiet estate in Saint-Luc de Varennes, inspiring collaborations, rivalries, and revolutions in visual culture. This chapter also traces how the fragile, lonely work of one determined inventor laid the foundation for an entirely new medium, one that would redefine memory, communication, science, and art. And finally, it closes with an outro that ties together the emotional and technological journey of Niepce's pursuit. Niepce's success did not bring immediate fame or recognition. Instead, it marked the beginning of a new and complex chapter. His invention was as revolutionary as it was fragile. The materials were temperamental, the exposure times painfully long, and the process required a level of precision and intuition that few could replicate. Yet these limitations only underscored the extraordinary nature of his breakthrough. He had accomplished something unprecedented. He had frozen time. realizing the immense potential of his method, but also aware of its complexities. Niepce began searching for collaborators who could help refine and publicize the process. This quest eventually led him to Louis Daguerre, a charismatic artist and stage designer known for his mastery of illusion and visual spectacle. Daguerre possessed a blend of scientific curiosity and artistic flair, making him an ideal partner for advancing Niepce's invention. Their partnership was not only a merging of two minds, but also a merging of two worlds: the meticulous, methodical world of Niepce and the bold, theatrical world of Daguerre. Their collaboration, while productive, was not without tension. Niepce's heliographic process relied on light-sensitive bitumen and long exposures, while Daguerre sought a faster, more commercially viable method. Despite these differences, the partnership led to significant innovations. Together, they explored alternative chemical combinations, experimented with metal plates, and tested new solvents. Daguerre's relentless pursuit of speed and clarity pushed the boundaries of what Niepce believed possible. Meanwhile, Niepce's steady hand and deep understanding of light ensured that the experimentation remained grounded in scientific rigor. Tragically, Niepce passed away in 1833, before witnessing the enormous impact of the photographic revolution he initiated. After his death, Daguerre continued refining the method, ultimately developing the daguerreotype, a process capable of producing clearer images in minutes rather than hours. When Daguerre introduced the daguerreotype to the world in 1839, it ignited an international sensation. People marveled at the ability to capture a moment with such fidelity, to see the world as the eye saw it, but preserved forever. Daguerre's success, however, initially overshadowed Niepce's foundational contributions. It took decades before Niepce received the recognition he deserved. Historians, scientists, and artists eventually traced the origins of photography back to his courtyard image, his view from the window at Le Gras, which proved he had achieved what no one else had: the first permanent photographic image. His patient experiments, his insights into light-sensitive materials, and his unwavering belief in the possibility of fixing light formed the bedrock upon which the entire field of photography was built. Photography soon expanded beyond scientific curiosity into countless domains. Portrait studios emerged in major cities, offering the general public an opportunity once reserved for the wealthy, to have their likeness captured and preserved. Scientists used photography to document astronomical events, microscopic organisms, and distant landscapes. Governments began using it for mapping, identification, and historical record-keeping. Artists adopted photography as both a tool and a medium, exploring its potential for realism, abstraction, storytelling, and experimentation. Every one of these transformations echoed back to Niepce's original vision. The power of photography reshaped memory, its moments that once faded into the fog of human recollection could now be preserved with clarity and permanence. Families documented generations. Travelers captured foreign worlds. Historic events became visual records rather than second-hand accounts. The photograph became a universal language, unbound by literacy, culture, or geography. and all of it traced back to Niepce's solitary experiments in light, chemistry, and patience. Niepce's legacy is not only the invention of photography, but also the method by which he achieved it. Through quiet persistence, endless curiosity, and the courage to challenge what was believed possible. He confronted failure not as defeat, but as information, refining his understanding until he unlocked the world's first fixed image. His work demonstrated that innovation often begins long before public recognition, in the silent spaces where passion and perseverance meet. This entire journey, from Niepce's earliest observations of light to the creation of the first photograph, reveals a profound truth about invention. It is rarely loud or glamorous at the start. Instead, it emerges from hours of unseen dedication, from ideas tested and abandoned, from notes scribbled in margins, from moments of quiet intuition. Niepce worked without applause, without assurance, and often without support. Yet he persisted, driven by a vision that only he could see at the time. And because he persisted, the world changed. Every photograph taken today, every portrait, landscape, memory, celebration, tragedy, or discovery, carries a trace of Niepce's work. His first image was not merely a technical achievement. It was a doorway into a new way of seeing, remembering, and expressing reality. As the story of Niepce closes, what remains is not just the history of a process, but the inspiration of a journey. A reminder that even the smallest beginnings, driven by curiosity and resilience, can shape the future in ways the world never expects.